Okay, so thank you everybody for coming. As you know, at Edge Hill, we love to have big names from the world of politics to come and speak to us. So, of course, we're delighted to have the Right Honourable Sir Vince Cable here to talk about his experiences in politics and a sort of lengthy career in politics, which with his writing appears to be continuing. My name's Paula Keaveney. I'm the Programme Leader for Politics at Edge Hill. So I'm delighted that Edge Hill is able to attract speakers of the calibre of Sir Vince. I'm going to be asking a few questions to kick things off, but this is really about you. This is your chance to think of those questions that you want to ask and to really get the most from our visitor, who we're delighted to see with us today. And you've had such a long career, if you don't mind me saying so, but it's almost impossible to isolate a few questions to ask you. But perhaps I could start off by saying, when you look at the House of Commons today, is there anything you miss?
Well, I'm glad I retired when I did. I'd had 20 years. The nature of Parliament changed a great deal over the period I was in it. I mean, the makeup has changed quite a lot. It's now become very much a kind of all-graduate place. It's lost a lot of its diversity in that sense. When I first became an MP, there were a lot of working class Labour MPs, particularly, ex-miners, factory workers. They've all gone, almost all of them. On the positive side, there are a lot more women, a lot more ethnic minorities who, actually risen to the cabinet. So the composition has changed. I think the other thing that's changed about the way it functions is it's become a bit more sensible. There was a lot of flummery. These ancient traditions and so on were deeply entrenched, and it was very conservative with a small c. The idea that you should just sit all night through parliamentary sittings, and it didn't really matter because people didn't worry about their families. That kind of thing has gone, and I think particularly with more women coming in. And I was very grateful because in the first session, my late wife was very ill with cancer, and I was doing caring as well as being an MP. And I had to go home. And, similarly, young women with babies. And we got the rules of Parliament changed, so it became much more family friendly and much more practical.
When you were first elected, and you had to try several times, didn't you? This is the way with Lib Dems. You often can't win the first time. Did you ever really think that you'd be in the cabinet?
No, I didn't. I got in at the fifth attempt. That was 4 as a Lib Dem and previously a Labour. And that was over 30 years. That's a bit extreme. But I think most people who are going into politics have to accept that there's a very high chance you'll fail, right? You have to be in the right place at the right time in the right party. And I realized over the 30 years before I became an MP, there were an awful lot of people who were cleverer than me, they were better politicians, probably better people, but they sort of fell by the wayside because career, family, they just happened to be in the wrong place. And politics is a lot of luck. But specifically on the cabinet, I don't think we imagined that we were going to finish up in a coalition. It was only about 3 months before the end of the 2010 Parliament that we began to realize this is a realistic possibility and started doing some scenario planning. But hitherto, the Lib Dems had been an insurgent party, and we got quite a lot of traction, particularly under Charles Kennedy. But because of the nature of British politics, it was very difficult to translate our support in the country into parliamentary seat, the first past the post. We had, before 2010, we had about 20% of the public. It went up and down, but it was about 20. but we'd only got 50, 60 at a maximum, whereas we should have had 150 under a more representative system. So I think the mindset in the party was a sort of third party insurgent, kind of used to guerrilla warfare rather than set piece battles. And we've gone back to that because of the damage to our position since 2015.
When you were asked to join the cabinet, did you have mixed feelings about it, or were you, delighted to do it?
Well, 2010 was quite an important part of modern British history, and a lot of people asked, why did you finish up in a coalition with the Conservatives? I was quite intimately involved with all the process. I was Nick Clegg's deputy at the time, and I was, partly because of personal relationships, partly I was deputed to talk to Gordon Brown about working with Labour, and some of us would have been more comfortable doing that, but there weren't the numbers, as it happened. We'd not have been able to put together a coalition, probably just about, if we had gone on hands and foot and begged the Ulster Unionists and the Scottish Nationalists, which would have been a rather dangerous thing to do. There weren't the numbers. Gordon, anyway, didn't have the support of his colleagues. A lot of, Ed Ball, the Miliband's, they wanted out. We'd just come through the financial crisis, and I think they saw a horrific period of austerity ahead, whoever was in government. So they wanted out. And the Conservatives with us could make a clear majority. I didn't particularly like the idea, but I saw the political logic of it. And there was at the time a real sense of national emergency. I mean, we'd had the collapse of the banks. Britain's position in international credit markets was very weak. We had an enormous deficit. There was enormous pressure on us. I was getting telephone calls from key people in the civil service, messages from the governor of the central bank saying, for God's sake, you guys have got to recognize the national interest. We need a stable government which is able to make difficult decisions. So I felt we had very little choice. I think if I'd been fully in control of events, I would have pushed to be Chancellor rather than the business secretary, but we didn't have the clout to make that happen. And I would have insisted on taking the job on the basis that I had full responsibility of the banking system and that I didn't have responsibility for universities. But in the kind of frantic process of coalition making, all these things were decided in 5 minutes, and I didn't have a chance to argue. Yeah.
So looking at the party now, obviously there were a lot of losses in 2015. You were one of them, but the party has recovered somewhat. What advice would you've been a leader twice, what advice would you give Ed Davey?
Well, I don't believe in backseat driving in politics. It's a rather dangerous thing to do and an unhelpful thing to do. So I'm not offering him advice publicly or privately. I think the starting point is we suffered a terrible hammering back in 2015, mainly because the government, the coalition government, was actually very good for the country, but it was very bad for the party. And we've never fully recovered since. Public opinion support has fluctuated around 10%. It was 20% before, and it's never really got back to satisfactory levels. There was a period when I was the leader, towards the end of that period, when we had a brilliantly successful European election and local elections, and we got up to 20% again in the public opinion polls. But I think we, and I speak collectively here, misjudged what was happening. The 2019 election became polarized into Brexit versus Jeremy Corbyn. And there were a lot of people who would have supported the Lib Dems, wanted to support the Lib Dems, but they were scared by certainly if they were what we call soft conservatives, with the worry about Corbyn getting into government. So they stuck with the Tories, even though they hated it and they were Remainers. So we were squeezed. My advice to Ed Davey, which is your question, is doing what he is doing, which is trying to build up the party from the bottom rather than the top. There's no point, leader of the Lib Dems, going around making great speeches about saving the world. What you need is proper representation in Parliament, which reflects our support in the country. And you've got to win back seat by seat by seat. And there are places like Southport in this area which slipped away, and they've got to be won back again. And he is putting all our efforts into target seats, most of them in the south of England, as it happens. Conservative held seats in the south of England, and that's the way to do it. And if we get up to 30 plus MPs, that will be a good outcome, I think, at the next election. And if, as I expect, we get a Labour minority government, we will find ourselves once again in a crucial position.
Yeah, so we've had Lord Ashdown, we've had Lord Steele, we've had Lord Campbell, but we haven't had Lord Cable. Why is that?
Well, you haven't had that because I was asked if I wanted to go into the House of Lords in 2015 when I lost my seat. I won it back later. And I turned it down because I thought I had a kind of obligation to myself and the party to regain my own constituency and fight again. And as it happened, Theresa May called another election and I got a chance to do that. And I also had very mixed feelings about the House of Lords. I mean, it is a very corrupt institution. I mean, just an anecdote. When I was party leader, I had a distinguished business person come up to me and he said, look, I've given Mr. Cameron for his party £2 million. The peerage hasn't arrived. Can you do any better? And that rather summarized for me what the House of Lords is all about. I mean, it's a place where you can buy a peerage, you can be a bag carrier for a party leader or a prime minister. There's a young woman who was a research assistant for 3 months, but Boris obviously took a liking to her and just said, okay, you can be a baroness. I mean, any system that operates like that you shouldn't want to be in it. And I would hope that if Mr. Starmer has sufficient authority in the next Parliament, he will actually get rid of it. Of course, you need an alternative. It could either be elected, or my preference would be to have a House of Lords just chosen at random, like a jury, and just representative of the public. That's I don't know quite how that would work in detail, but the present system is just unacceptable, actually, and it's a disgrace to the country.
So, thinking about the general election, if there is a situation in which no one party has a majority and the Lib Dems again find themselves in the situation of kingmakers, as it were, what should the party be doing?
Well, let's take the argument step by step. The first step is what will happen in the next election. None of us know. I've been asked periodically to think about what different scenarios could happen. I think there's a 10% chance, maybe a bit less, that the Conservatives will get back again. We shouldn't rule that out. They did in 1992 when everybody assumed that after Thatcher and poll tax and all that, they would be swept away. They weren't. So that I would give that, I'd say, a 10% probability. I think there's probably something like a 40% probability you'll get an overall Labour government with a clear majority. But that's not easy because they would need a 12% lead average going into the election. The position in Scotland is very unpredictable, and the Scottish nationalists probably have more visceral nationalist support than we're giving them credit for. There will be 2 or 3 seats that may be lost because of Islamic feeling around Gaza and all that. there's a handful of hardline Corbynites who he can't rely on. So to get an overall comfortable majority of, say, 20 or 30, which would enable him to run the country, would be quite tricky. And I wouldn't give that much more than a 40% chance. So 50% probability that we get either a hung parliament or something where they've got a wafer-thin majority. And if that happens, his first instincts, I think, will be to try to get other parties to work with Labour. They are unlikely, I think, to go to the Scottish Nationalists. That would be quite a dangerous thing to do, because they only have one issue, and it's either yes or no. I mean, I think it would be even more difficult working with the Democratic Unionists on Ireland. Sinn Féin will continue to stay away. So that leaves the Lib Dems, actually. So we then, put in the front line. And I think the view in the party is likely to be that we don't want to be in another coalition because we would be swamped. I mean, the last coalition, we were outnumbered 6-1. And, we lost a lot of political battles as a result. And with Labour, it would be 10-1, 12-1. I mean, you can't have a coalition on that basis. So it would be, I think, a question of giving support from the backbenches, what's called supply and confidence, voting with the government on confidence issues or on the budget. I think the party would want something in return, which would be reform of the voting system. And one of the crucial issues in this coming election is whether Starmer includes in the Labour manifesto a commitment to electoral reform. It's very clear that the Labour Party as a party and the trade unions want that, but so far there's a hardcore around him who don't. And you can understand why, because it would mean some Labour MPs losing their seats. If they don't have it in the manifesto, then that would mean that it would be very difficult for a new government to introduce it, and it would reduce their scope for bargaining with us. So the conclusion I come to is that if I was going to a bookmaker, I would put my money on having 2 elections. They may find themselves in exactly the same position as Harold Wilson in 1966, 64, and in 74. And we may be rerunning history like that.
Yeah, so that's going to be very exhausting for those of us that teach politics. So I've worked in public relations and journalism as well. So I always look out for the sound bites, and you have one of the famous sound bites in the Commons when you described Gordon Brown as going from Stalin to Mr. Bean. Was that your line, or was that from a clever speechwriter?
It was my line. In retrospect, I wasn't terribly proud of it, actually, because
we liked it.
But because I rather like Gordon Brown, and I wouldn't say he was a close friend, but I knew him quite well, and I didn't particularly want to inflict any personal damage on him. But it struck a note at the time. I mean, the problem is, as a politician, you're often remembered for the wrong things. And I did have actually quite a lot of good speeches in Parliament which have long since been forgotten. And people have remembered one thing that I wasn't desperately proud of.
So what would you like to be remembered?
No, I will... no, I can't spontaneously think. That's the whole point. You do good stuff and it just disappears.
So I'm going to ask one more question and then it's over to the audience. So looking back at your lengthy time in politics and thinking about perhaps younger people who are thinking about a career in politics, what one piece of advice would you give?
Well, you've got to be patient and resilient and recognise that there's actually a lot of setbacks. And I think a second point which is related to that is to have a sort of hinterland of things you can fall back on emotionally, psychologically, I always say to people, it's very important to have a good family or good relationships, because you need that kind of emotional backup. It isn't all glamour and being on telly. It's dealing with the defeats and the setbacks, and often you're getting a lot of abuse. I mean, difficult relationships, people attacking what you're doing, and you either need an extraordinarily strong, resilient personality, or you need people with you who can help keep you going. And I've been very lucky. I had 2 happy marriages, as it happens, but other people in other ways.
Yeah. So be patient, be resilient, and have a fantastic support network.
Yeah.
That's what you're saying. So I am going to stop there, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Roxandra Trandafoyu, who is going to invite members of the audience to ask questions. And another colleague, Jo Crotty, is the woman with the microphone. So please wait for the microphone to get to you before you start asking your questions. So over to you, Roxandra. I don't know, Rachel, do you want to come and sit here?
Okay, so I teach political communication and I've got lots of questions, but so if you make me, I'll ask them. But please feel free.
Evening. Hello. I'd just like to start on a topical question, and it's not directly related to yourself, Savins, but it's about the current situation in the Middle East. And I was wondering what you thought about the prospects of a long-term solution and how it can be resolved more immediately.
Well, I'm actually very pessimistic. I find it very difficult to see, in a way that looking at the big picture, it's a sort of conflict between right and right. It's in Ukraine, it's right versus wrong. It's very clear who's on the right side of the argument. But with the Middle East dispute, I mean, the Israelis have a perfectly understandable craving for security, and they were, deeply hurt and frightened by this rather brutal terrorist attack. And equally, the Palestinians have a perfectly good argument. They've been driven off their own land, and it's continuing to be encroached on by settlers and so on. So when you've got 2 sides, both of whom are in the right, but who are at loggerheads and can't give ground, what hope do you have of a solution? What I fear is that we are going to get a solution, but it's a rather bleak one. I think the Israelis are basically going to drive the Palestinians into a small corner of the Gaza Strip and turn it into a permanent refugee settlement. I mean, there are large refugee groups of Palestinians in Lebanon and in Jordan, and they will now create another one in the Gaza Strip. And it will lead to terrible hardship and frustration. But the problem is there's no pressure on them, really, to do anything else. I mean, people talk about a 2-state solution, but somebody will need to impose that on the Israelis, and nobody's going to do that. The Americans are not neutral in this, so how and why are they going to do it? So I'm afraid that is the likely outcome, and it's not a good one, and it means that one side is going to come out of this in a very bad way.
Well, thank you for coming. Just touching on that last point, do you think the Israeli response has been proportionate to what's happened on October the 7th?
No, it isn't proportionate. I mean, I was actually in the front line of this particular issue, because one of the responsibilities I had in the government, I was responsible for trade, and within that for arms export licensing, which is quite a tricky role. And when the Gaza war happened, was it 2014, 2013? I was ultimately responsible for making a decision about whether we should stop exporting parts of aircraft to the Israel Defense Force. And I took the view that it was disproportionate, what they were doing at the time, which was heavy carpet bombing of Gaza City in response to fairly minor raids. And I stopped it. But the problem then was that the Conservatives within the coalition objected to what I was doing and tried to, and it was taken to Cameron, and the decision was quashed. We then had a sort of quite a bitter argument, and we reached a compromise which involved stopping the sale of several components of airplanes. Rachel may remember we were walking on our summer holidays through some ancient ruins in France, and I was having to negotiate with Phil Hammond, who was the Defence Secretary, which parts should be banned and which shouldn't. And we did eventually implement this ban on exports, but by then the fighting had stopped. But the worst of it was that I personally and my colleagues in the government were being attacked on the one side by the Palestinians because we hadn't acted sooner or more decisively, and we were then attacked by the Israelis because we'd done something, and this was unfair to them and anti-Semitism and all that stuff. So we were, it goes back to the earlier question, you couldn't get it right because whatever you did, you were going to antagonize one side or the other. And of course, what's happening now is the problem, of course, 10 times worse. It is disproportionate, but we then go back to the sort of fundamentals of the dispute, who's right and who's wrong, and how do you get a solution?
Apologies, can you hear me now? Sorry. Peel split the Conservative Party over the Corn Laws. Joe Chamberlain split the Liberal Party over tariff reform. The lesson I would take from that is that when free trade and protectionism go to war, the governing party splits. Is Brexit doing that to the Conservative Party, and is that an opportunity for the Liberal Democrats?
Brexit split the Conservative Party.
Yes, well, we thought that what you were analysing was going to happen at the last election, because there was a very deep split in the Tory party between kind of your traditional middle of the road, fairly moderate, outward looking kind of conservatives, people who are liberal, quite liberal socially, people like Cameron. But of course, Boris Johnson expelled them. The really impressive Tories at the end of the last parliament, people like Ken Clarke, were actually expelled from the Tory party because they were not supporting Brexit in the form that Johnson had negotiated it. So they've already had their split. And we thought, misguidedly, in the 2019 election, that all those Remainers would be so disgusted by what Johnson had done that they would all flock to the Lib Dems. But for reasons I gave earlier, this didn't happen. I mean, I wasn't leader at the end of that parliament, but I do remember attending a meeting about a month before the election, and our people thought we were going to win 150 seats on the basis of all these alienated moderate conservatives. But the problem was, in the election, they panicked when they saw that the alternative was Jeremy Corbyn, and they went back to the Tory party. Now, the question is, could that happen again? And I think probably most of the moderate Tories have gone. There's a handful left. I mean, Jeremy Hunt is a good example. Maybe even the Prime Minister in his private, but of course he was a Brexiteer. So the old style Tories that I sort of grew up with, people who were kind of prided themselves on the middle of the road and borrowing some ideas from Labour and the Liberals and so on, and that's gone. And the real interesting issue, I think, after the next election is what will happen if they veer even further to the right. I mean, there is a possibility that somebody like Suella Braverman to take over. There is an outside possibility that all the UKIP people who have infiltrated the Tory party, much in the same way that the Corbynites infiltrated the Labour Party, that those UKIP people could effectively take over. And there is a kind of fantasy, which some of them have, that they would bring in Nigel Farage and he would take over. I mean, it seems quite likely that after the next election, that the Tories will become very nationalistic, very right-wing in that kind of way. And then I think that's the point at which the Lib Dems start to have a real opportunity, because the mainstream Tories of old have nowhere else to go. And then I think they may then turn to us, but that will be after the election, not before.
Thanks for everything you've said. I'm a lecturer in religious education here at Edgehill, and on Thursday I'll be talking to my Year 2 undergraduates about the Bible in politics. We will look at Tony Benn's Bible, Thatcher's Bible, Blair's Bible, brief mentions for Cameron and Johnson and Rees-Mogg, and we'll touch on Tim Farron's Bible. As someone who might be said to have benefited from Tim Farron's religious views, what would Cable's Bible be, or what are your views on the role of religion in politics?
Well, I tend to think that this is a matter for individual conscience. I don't like it when political parties take up religious positions. I think, take some of the people I really admire, Shirley Williams and Charles Kennedy were both Roman Catholics and committed. I mean, they weren't just nominal Catholics, they were practicing Catholics. So they had this dilemma about what you do in a very liberal party, which was where most people's instincts were to have a very liberal approach to abortion, homosexuality. And what they did was to, they didn't speak out about it. They didn't try to criticize the liberal views of their colleagues in the party. But when it came to voting themselves, they would say, look, I have my own faith, and I will vote, abstain or do whatever I have to do. The person who got into trouble over this was Tim Farron, who was my predecessor, who was an evangelical Christian, whereas, you know, they have very strong views on gay relationships. And he was rather foolish, I think, in a perfectly innocent way, in seeming to attack gay people for their sins, right? I mean, he didn't mean it in a personal way, but he was just reflecting his faith. So I think the answer to your question is, if people are able, like Shirley Williams and Charles Kennedy, to have religious convictions, but not to try to impose it on other people, that strikes me as being the right kind of formula. The worry I would have in the longer term is that we become more like the United States, that religion becomes very much embedded in the political system. You get militants with religious convictions trying to push parties into one position or another. You've seen what's happened with the Republican Party in America. I mean, Biden, you know, is a Catholic, and he manages to keep his personal conviction, which I'm sure are very genuine, separate from his role as president of the country. But there are people who seem unable to make that separation.
There's a question there from the lady on the back row.
If you had the opportunity to change the voting system in the country, would you change it, and what would you change it to?
Sorry, I missed
Had the opportunity to change the voting system.
Yes.
How would you change it?
Yes. I think a lot of people would start by accepting that the British voting system is very seriously flawed. It's producing governments that are very unrepresentative, which don't have majority support. You can easily become a government in this country with only 40% of the vote and maybe 30% of the electorate. So we're getting unrepresentative governments, and we're getting minority views that have been squeezed out. I mean, I don't just want to promote my own party, but if you're a Green, and I think growing numbers of young people are, you have virtually no chance of being in the House of Commons. They've got one MP, Caroline, who will retire, and they will have great difficulty holding that seat. So they may finish up with no MPs at all. Though there's a lot of people in Britain who would like to see environmental Green people elected to Parliament, as they are in many parts of Europe. So the arguments for having electoral reform are very powerful, but the trick which your question hints at is, how do you do it in a way that doesn't give us an even worse system? And I think the sensible compromise, which was put out in the Jenkins report, which Tony Blair commissioned, I think around about the year 2000, came up with a formula which was a bit like the German system. In other words, you have constituency, as we do at the moment, which elect a local MP, and then you have an additional group of MPs who make up the numbers to reflect the overall balance of opinion in the country. And what that will tend to produce is a combination of genuine local MPs with a constituency base, but more representative parliament, and you'll very probably get into an era of coalition governments of the kind they've had in Germany. Germany is a generally very well-run country and a very stable country and a successful democracy. There is a variant of this in Scotland. The Scottish Parliament is elected under a very similar kind of system, which is more representative than the UK as a whole. So that's the formula. I think it's been endlessly argued, and there are models in which we could have an electoral system which is fairer, but also leads to political stability.
Hi. I just wondered what your view was on why it was that so much of the people of the country voted for Brexit. What were they thinking, in your view?
Well, there was a mixture of things. I wasn't actually in Parliament at the time. Between 15 and 17, I was out in the wilderness. So I saw this from afar, but I did spend the Brexit campaign going round local meetings, mainly in the south of England, in conservative areas. I think it was fairly clear to me, certainly from the meetings I was attended in church halls in villages and so on, that there was a heavy Brexit vote outside London. And I think there are several factors. I think first, the factor that correlates most strongly with Brexit voting is age. I mean, not old people, not necessarily old people are anti-Europe, but a very high percentage of them were. And I think that was partly based on kind of nostalgia for the past and, Britain in its glory days and returning to the old Commonwealth and so on. So age was a key factor. Second, unfortunately, was education. There was a very high correlation with whether people had a university degree or not. Again, this rather mirrors the support for Trump in the United States, that populist parties are fishing in the market of people who, for no fault of their own, have not had access to higher education. So age, education, and you could add to that the fact that people were, rather alienated in the aftermath of the financial crisis. We had a period of austerity. I mean, I would argue whoever was in government, that was going to happen. That a lot of people were angry. They had their benefits cut. They'd seen some of their services locally decimated. It was mainly the benefits issue that made people in rather deprived area angry, and they turned out to vote against the government. And the fact that the campaign was led by Cameron and Osborne, who weren't particularly popular. Jeremy Corbyn, I think, has a major responsibility for Brexit because he just disappeared. The Labour Party was given no leadership, and they played virtually no role in the Brexit campaign. You've seen the outcome.
My question's relating to the previous question about the voting. Do you have an opinion on whether we should be compelled to vote, as they are in Australia? Would that make a difference, do you think?
I'm not sure it would make a great deal of difference. Most Australians I've encountered don't like that compulsory system because, abstention is a perfectly valid democratic choice. I mean, you may take the view that, all political parties are useless and corrupt and I don't want anything to do with it. I mean, it's a perfectly, it may not be very constructive, but it's a perfectly valid point of view. So why should you be compelled and fined if you don't actually vote? I suppose the answer to people who feel that is that they should turn up to vote and spoil their ballot papers. I'm not sure that's terribly helpful. No, I'm not sure it would change very much.
You've touched on it a bit about the sort of Lib Dems resurgence and their fight back, seeing that it's mostly focused on the South. What is the path for the Liberal Democrats in sort of Labour-facing areas? If you go back 20 years, the Liberal Democrats ran a lot of metropolitan boroughs, Liverpool, Birmingham, Rotherham, all sort of over the country. What is the path back for the Liberal Democrats in those sort of areas? Is there one?
I think there is. And I think we're going to see history repeating itself. For this reason, I mean, let's assume for the moment we get a Labour government, which in probability we will. What is almost certain is that people will get disillusioned very quickly because there isn't a great deal they can do. And to their credit, they're being honest about that. I mean, Rachel Reeves and Starmer are saying, look, we can't spend money because the budget position is so dire. So they're setting expectations very low. But even then, people will say, well, why is nothing changing? And they will become frustrated. And what will then happen is, people in local government elections particularly will want an alternative. It could be that they turn to this extreme right Reform Party. It could be. But I think they're more likely to do what they've done in the past, which is going to the Lib Dems, who they know about and are sensible people and generally work hard at local grassroots politics. So I think what we may then find is that in Liverpool, in Newcastle, Sheffield, Hull, Oldham, places that the Lib Dems used to run, and that's still do in one or two cases like Hull, that those places will again become kind of Lib Dem municipal strongholds. The problem for my Lib Dem friends who are active in the grassroots is that local government is becoming an absolute hell. Councils are going bankrupt all over the country. They just can't cope anymore. Whether they're Lib Dem, Tory, Labour, nothing to do with it. It's a culmination of generations of neglect and infantilization of local government. And what is now happening is that local councils are overspending on special needs for education because it's demand-led and they have a legal obligation to provide it. They're coping with large numbers of elderly people for whom they have responsibility to provide social care. At the the same time, their revenue position is very weak because they're not allowed to put out council tax, and they don't want to because it's seen as a rather aggressive tax, particularly at the bottom end of the council tax scale. And the government is cutting their funding anyway because of the constraints on public funding. So I think actually the biggest political crisis in this country is around local government. I mean, you know, we talk about a lot of other things, but we're the only country in Europe that doesn't have effective local government. And France, Germany, Italy, they have regional government or local government, and it sort of works in different ways. Spain, we don't. You know, we have this very, very centralized system where everything of importance is decided in Whitehall, and what's left in local government has been cut to pieces to a point where it's no longer viable. And basically, you know, in the next year, we're going to get dozens of councils basically just handing back the keys and saying that we just can't cope anymore. Central government will have to run this area. And I think if I were back in politics, I would put this absolutely at the top of the agenda, which is rebuilding local government, giving them the capacity to raise revenue, letting local government have much more freedom to make decisions. Because the system is in a state of collapse. And, you know, you're going to realize when old people, for example, can no longer get any kind of social care, which is what we're heading towards, people will realize the fact that, you know, libraries are having to shut, parks are having to shut, bins are not collected anymore. I mean, you know, we're heading potentially for serious breakdown, you know.
In 2010, I feel like the Liberal Democrats borrowed a heavy proportion of the young voters, quite strongly on the election pledge not to raise university fees. That was obviously a promise that could not be kept in the coalition. Do you feel like that was seen by the youth vote that you had taken as a betrayal to their vote? And do you think the party has been able to recover from that since?
Well, that issue obviously has done the party a lot of damage. But I think it's unfair in one sense because all parties in government make promises that they break and have to break. You know, a typical example is the Tories making all these ridiculous promises about immigration. You know, we will cut immigration to under 100,000. It's just a farce, right? But for some reason, they aren't being held to the same standard of expectation of the Lib Dems. I mean, the Labour Party, rather stupid, very stupid, this weekend have made the same pledge about immigration. They're not going to be able to meet it. People will be let down. They're going to be betrayed and feel betrayed. So, there is this sort of tremendous pressure on politicians going into an election to promise things. I've written about it in this book I've done with Rachel. We had quite a bitter argument actually in the Lib Dems about tuition fees before the 2010 election. My view was that we should have promised absolutely nothing to anybody. And we should have gone into that election with Churchill's blood, sweat and tears. We should have said, you're going to have 5 years of pain because of the collapse of the banking system. Everything is going to be cut. I'm sorry, we can't promise you anything. That my colleagues regarded that as despair, negativity. They felt they had to be positive about something. So we made some promises, of which the tuition fees was the most egregiously foolish. But you know, there's a pressure on all parties. I mean, I'm just thinking about the next election. And as I've said, the Labour Party are being very austere, they're promising very little. And their approach, I think, has been very well summed up by Wes Streeting, when he said that no hope is better than false hope. So you're really saying to the public, there's no hope, we can't do anything. And that is honest, but, you know, people do need to be given some kind of hope, don't they? So there's this terrible tension, promising stuff you can't realistically deliver, or telling people it's all hopeless. And I think we clearly got that wrong in 2010, that we've paid a disproportionate political price.
I mean, thinking back to 2010 and the negotiations with the Conservative government over the coalition, do you think you should have been bolder as Liberal Democrats in your demands for, say, like an office of state? I mean, one of the things that always puzzled me is, given that, you know, you've got an excellent knowledge of international relations, why you weren't appointed as Foreign Secretary, for example. I mean, I think that would have been a good shout.
Well, we've endlessly gone over, could we have done better? I think probably not. The area where I think, in retrospect, and I was part of the process, so I carry some responsibility for it, is that we got a very weak deal from the Tories over electoral reform. They hated the whole idea because, of course, electoral reform would destroy the Tories' permanent grip on government. But all they were willing to do was offer a referendum around a very weak system called the alternative vote, which is the Australian model, as it happens. It doesn't change very much. And there was only a referendum. The Labour Party wasn't willing to do anything to support it, so we were crushed. So we got a very bad deal on that. On the coalition agreement in general, 80% of what the Lib Dems have asked for was in there and was delivered. But on the very big one, which was electoral reform, we had a weak hand and didn't play it very strongly. But I go back to the basic point. We were outnumbered 6-1. And when you're in that position, you're not in a position to ask for a great deal. And one of the Tories' preconditions was that they would have the three big jobs in government: Foreign Secretary, Home Secretary, and Chancellor. Clegg became Deputy Prime Minister, but they insisted on keeping those three jobs. I pushed to be the Chancellor. I said, why can't I? But in the bargaining process, we lost that. It would have been much better to have had a Lib Dem Chancellor, it would have been me in this case, than a Foreign Secretary. There's not a great deal a Foreign Secretary can do.
I have a question myself now, if you don't mind, because you spoke about the importance of having strong family support when you work in politics. You wrote a new book with your wife, Rachel. So maybe you can tell us a little bit what you wanted to achieve with the book. Maybe Rachel can start.
Okay.
Right, thank you very much. Yes, this is not part of the marriage contract. He does the talking. I do the rest, really. However, we have written this book together partly because as the spouse of a politician, you become aware very quickly that this is not a 9-to-5 job, and you spend quite a lot of time on your own and waiting for the partner to come back. So I did a lot of writing, partly to get things off my chest, partly because I was some of the time in the countryside. I still had a small herd of Dexter cattle at the time. And the conflict between needing to be smart in London and feeding cows was quite dramatic for me. So I unloaded a lot into a diary. And when Vince was shown this finally, he said he thought some of it was very interesting and would be interesting to other people. And David Boyle of Real Press agreed and helped us. And we had a researcher who kind of kept the peace. And we wrote it, mostly during lockdown, of course. So there it is. Vince's part is an explanation of some of the things you've been asking about. And my bit is sort of asides. Some of them I hope not snide, but certainly irreverent. And I think other people in political marriages will find some of the same issues. So that's what it was all about, and I hope people will like it. We just got 3 copies. You can get it online from Amazon for rather less, but I think this is now £12. And if anybody would like one and like one signed, there they are. And I'll now ask Vince about his views on it. Oh, he doesn't need it. He's got a mic.
Just to add a little bit, the purpose, it's a very unusual political biography. You know, you don't normally have this kind of counterpoint. But essentially, it's we've interwoven my observations about what was happening in politics with Rachel's diaries. And it's, you know, he said, she said, he said, she said. And I think most people have found it's a different and interesting way of writing a biography. There was a Tory MP called Swire, who was a junior minister at the Foreign Office, whose wife has written this really rather, what's the right word? Snide. I think that's the polite way. No. Gossipy account of relationships with the Tories and Cameron and so on. But it's not quite like that. But Rachel had views of her own. And just going back to the last question, I noticed in her diaries, she had been following the coalition negotiations very carefully and had noticed what we had agreed on electoral reform. And she said, oh no, this is going to cause no end of trouble. Yeah. And it did. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. I'm sorry we're out of time, but thank you for the great range of questions that you asked. And I'll pass on to my colleague Liam for final words.
Well, thank you, Sir Vince, for such a stimulating and insightful conversation. I'm sure you've given us all very, very much to think about. Friends, colleagues, visitors, I've got the privilege of being the Pro Vice-Chancellor at Edge Hill for External Relations, and it's my job this evening to bring the evening to a close. We bring many guests and visitors to the university over the course of a year. Last month, we celebrated a very, very successful Black History Month, and November, under Paula's guidance, is very much shaped up to be Politics Month. We've been delighted to welcome Baroness Cathy Ashton to the university. A number of weeks ago, we had the journalist and alumni Dan Hodges here, and this evening it's been a real pleasure to welcome Sir Vince and Rachel. Vince, as we've heard, a public figure who has featured very large in our political landscape over the last 25 years, following a very successful and varied career in economics. And although he might be the economist, Rachel is clearly the businesswoman, so £12 for the books, you can get one on your way out. He, following his successful and varied career in economics, elected as Liberal Democrat MP for Twickenham in 1997, re-elected in 2001, 2005, 2010, each time with an increased majority, becoming deputy leader, as we've heard, in 2006. And as we spent a lot of time hearing about this evening, entering coalition government in 2010. So Vince left government in 2015, returned in 2017, as we've heard, retaking the Twickenham seat and replaced Tim Farron as leader of the party afterwards, standing down as leader in 2019 and leaving the Commons at the general election in 2019. His latest book, How to Be a Politician, was released in 2022. It is without doubt essential reading for all of our politics students and for anyone who's got an interest in what makes our politicians tick. And I may hesitate to add that perhaps it would make a very good stocking filler for some of our current members of Parliament. And perhaps you, Rachel, could arrange for those to be distributed. The agent, yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. I think we've had a lot of candour tonight from Sir Vince. It's been really refreshing to hear that. Thank you. It's been a very engaging, very entertaining evening. On behalf of all of us at Edge Hill, I'd like to thank Sir Vince for his time, and to Rachel too for your insight. And I know you were talking to our politics students earlier, and we're very grateful to you. We hope you've enjoyed your visit. Hope you found out a little bit about the university and the work that we do here. And as always, you are very, very assured of a warm welcome should you ever want to return. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you to our visitors.